Gentlemen, top of the agenda is the issue of energy security, and these reports today, particularly in the Weekend Australian, about what Alan Finkel, the government's chief scientist, is expected to recommend in a report to be brought to the Council of Australian Governments next Friday. Ben Oquist, to you first. You have said in your official capacity as Executive Director of the Australia Institute that a well-designed low emissions target, LET, which is what is talked about in the Weekend Australian today, a well-designed LET could be the basis for the needed integration of climate and energy policy in Australia. In other words, applause. Now, can you tell us what you think an LET means, and is it a carbon price by another name?
Well, it would provide a cost incentive for cleaner and renewable energy over dirtier or emissions intensively higher electricity sources like coal. We've got a renewable energy target and would work presumably in much the same way as that, but would allow in lower emission sources of electricity, presumably gas and presumably not coal, presumably theoretically CCS, or presumably theoretically nuclear power, but neither of those would stack up financially and you wouldn't get the investment in them, despite the government wanting to amend the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to put in CCS. The reality is it might be financeable if you change the law, but it's not investable in this country, and the same goes with nuclear. As long as a scheme was put in place that didn't over-reward gas and lock in investment for gas over too long a period, and the intensity trajectory, if you like, was set at a sufficient level, it could work. It's probably not optimal policy, but we're well past optimal policy in Australia as it relates to climate change. And a low emissions target could be a breakthrough that does integrate energy and climate policy, because unless we have that integration, remember, costs are going to be higher. That investment uncertainty is going to lead to higher costs and less reliable electricity for Australia. It's long past time we had some system that integrated climate and energy policy, because without it, prices are going to be higher, we're going to have less reliable energy. But it's a big moment for Malcolm Turnbull. He has to grasp this, having dumped the emissions intensity scheme. If he does the same thing to Finkel Mark II, it'll be a disaster. On the other hand, it potentially represents the next pivot for the Prime Minister. We've seen the pivot on debt and deficit, abandoning all debt being bad. We've seen the pivot on revenue with the bank tax, and to a lesser extent the Medicare levy, which probably isn't going as well, as seen as unfair. We've seen the pivot on Gonski. We've seen the pivot on government intervention, building Snowy Hydro, building Badgerys Creek. So the next big pivot required is on climate and energy policy, and what's being recommended by Finkel next week, an entree which has been served up by the Climate Change Authority yesterday in its report, underscores the importance again of that independent institution putting forward pragmatic, cost-effective, evidence-based policy. The next big pivot for the Prime Minister must be on climate and energy policy, and if he misses this, I think it'll be a complete disaster for his Prime Ministership.
Now, Ben Oquist, I've given you a good go, and I'll bring you in a moment, Simon. But before we do, I might go to a bit of an interview I had with Erica Betts, Liberal backbencher, a few minutes ago. He's been sceptical about the question of the Finkel report and suggested, in light of Donald Trump's decision pulling out of the Paris Accords, that the Turnbull government should delay presentation of Finkel. He doesn't seem to be in much doubt, if the reports in the newspapers this weekend are correct, that this does amount to a price on carbon. Take a look.
What's that, what they say about a duck? If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, chances are it is a duck. But look, I will await my final assessment to see what's actually in the report. But look, we have put forward, as a nation, a renewable energy target, and as I understand it, this low emission target would be in effect on top of the RET, and therefore that would, I think, have a substantial impact. But let's wait and see.
Simon Breheny, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, very old saying, being reheated there by Eric Betts. Do you think that a proposition of this kind, if it is as reported, could get through the coalition party room, or is Malcolm Turnbull buying more trouble?
I think Senator Betts has hit the nail on the head with this one. Of course, most people I think are going to see it as being what it is. I think there's already quite a lot of scepticism in the coalition party room within the Liberal backbench on the renewable energy target, and if the coalition is to go down the path which has been suggested by some in recent days of adding even more to the cost of energy through increasing the government's involvement in the energy market, then that's something that I think is going to be even less popular. So I think that if Malcolm Turnbull was to go down this path, I think really it's poking the bear. I mean, there are a lot of people who don't necessarily agree with the coalition's position, even on the RET, and you saw Senator Betts there talk about the government being committed to the renewable energy target. Now, you know, the fact that people like himself sitting on the backbench aren't out there saying the RET is a terrible idea, you know, I think Malcolm should bank it at the moment. He should bank the support that he's got within the party room for the government's current position. Adding to that in a climate where we've seen in recent days Donald Trump moving the United States away from these sorts of policies out of the Paris Accord, I think would be a huge mistake, particularly given the reality that faces the coalition in the lead up to the 2019 election. At the end of the day, there needs to be a choice that's put before electors. And if it looks as though the coalition is on the same page as the Greens or as the Labor Party when it comes to climate policy, then where do we think that those voters who have put the coalition into power in 2013, re-elected this government in 2016, are going to go? I think that that's a real political conundrum for the Prime Minister, and he can't just keep going down this path of saying we're going to move further and further and further to the left. It's going to be an electoral disaster because people will choose to vote, as we've already seen them do, vote for One Nation. They will choose to vote for principled Conservatives in the Australian Conservatives. There will be other parties that will come along that will eat the coalition's lunch in exactly the same way that the left has done when it comes to the battle that we see, particularly in inner city seats between the Greens and the Labor Party. So, do I think that moving down that path is a good political strategy for the coalition? Of course not. But I also think it's bad politics. At the end of the day, if you're pushing costs higher when it comes to electricity prices, you're making it more difficult for poorer people to heat their homes and cool their homes in winter and in summer. I think that's a terrible idea. So I think really what the government needs to do is, you know, the word that was used by Ben Oquist was to pivot. I think that's a good word, and I think that the coalition should be pivoting towards energy security, cheaper electricity rather than more expensive electricity over the long term.
Ben Oquist, on that question of the pivot, yes, I think you'll be able to address the exact point, but just to give it a bit of a spin from me here, isn't the problem for the Prime Minister that if there had been some sign in the polls that the pivot on questions of education, health, taxation in the budget had worked, he might have the authority with his backbench. But given that that has not happened, it's going to be that much harder for him to push that argument with sceptics within the party room.
I take what you mean, but I think those Abbott forces have less power. I think they're looking a little bit more shrill. Those advocating Australia following Trump's path look, as Paul Kelly said today, like the deluded right roaming around in the wilderness. And it's important to reflect upon political history too, and the trouble John Howard got in when he started siding with George Bush on Kyoto and climate change. And I know that following the carbon tax wars, there's a belief that any action on climate change is a vote loser for the coalition or a vote loser for the Labor Party, but things have moved on. And Australia has recommitted to Paris. The Prime Minister and his cabinet have made that clear that they've recommitted to Paris. And I actually think that will put fresh light and attention on Australia's domestic targets and domestic policy settings. The target of 26 to 28% that the government has is not even consistent with Paris. We have no 2050 target. We've got a plan to subsidise what would be the world's biggest export coal mine, and we've got no credible policies even to get us to 26 to 28%. And without that, we're actually going to see higher electricity prices and less reliability in our energy sector. We need to integrate climate and energy policy, otherwise there is this investment uncertainty. Remember, Tony Abbott's own climate skeptic independent reviewer Dick Warburton found the renewable energy target was putting downward pressure on electricity prices. We've got to get with the program. We need some policy setting, and I think that was one of the great lows ever in policy making in this country. Within 24 hours, when the government shot down, when the Prime Minister, under pressure from that right-wing rump in his backbench, shot down the idea of an emission intensity scheme, left Frydenberg high and dry. If they did that again, I really think it would shred the Prime Minister's credibility. He needs to do something to integrate climate and energy policy for prices, for reliability, and as Frydenberg says, to meet our emissions reduction targets.